welcome to Mount Kelly Prep Radio's 20 Questions, Episode 11, Shackleton Special, with the Honourable Alexandra Shackleton. Alexandra Shackleton is the granddaughter of the great Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. Although she never met him, she has spent much of her life studying his life. She is a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and the Explorers Club of New York. She is also the President of the James Caird Society. Firstly, why do you believe that Shackleton was a great leader and somebody who should be remembered for years to come?
I think I can answer that in one word: leadership, the way he led his men. That's why there's so much written about him and so enormous amount of interest.
What do you think of the claims that Shackleton's expedition was amateurish?
Well, everybody was an amateur in those days. There weren't any professional explorers like we almost have now. The thing is about my grandfather, he was always terribly short of money. You had to make do. And it's still an ongoing problem for expeditions to get funds. People talk about the fame and the fortune of being an explorer. Maybe fame, there certainly isn't fortune.
What do you believe was the reason that your grandfather wanted to lead this expedition to cross Antarctica?
I think he thought it was the last great polar goal. After all, he got within 97 miles of the pole, the Nimrod expedition, then he got back just about. Amundsen got there, Scott got there and tragically died on the way back. My grandfather's scheme to cross the Antarctic from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea via the pole, he regarded as the last great polar adventure.
Do you believe that your grandfather made the right decision to leave his family to lead the expedition?
Yes. Also, things were different in those days. I mean, if one had a husband in the Royal Navy at the China Station, you wouldn't see him for 4 years. And there's no way, given communications, it's difficult to get to the Antarctic, that you could there would be anything other than a long-term commitment.
How did your grandfather feel when he received the telegram from Winston Churchill telling him to proceed?
Relieved.
What effect did the fact that the First World War was imminent when your grandfather set off in the Endurance have upon him?
Well, it had been bubbling along, but it actually came to being. And of course, he lost some of the members of the expedition, the military members. And as you know, Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty, and grandfather offered himself the men and the ship for the war effort. And Churchill wrote famous telegram, proceed. So they had to go. They'd been preparing it. I don't think it had an enormous effect, apart from losing some of the members of the expedition.
How do you think Shackleton was able to persuade Sir James Caird, amongst others, to fund the majority of the expedition?
I think he was if I can say so, he was a very appealing, charismatic person and good at persuading people. You had to be in those days as an explorer with no money, and none of them had any money. And Sir James Caird sort of was impressed, and Ernest Shackleton had already got a couple of sponsors. When Sir James Caird said, if you get the sponsors give up their claims, how would it be if there was a man of Scotland who'd give you the full amount? It's £24,000, which now would be millions?
Yeah, yes. I think it's 1.2
yes.
or something
yes.
like that. So do you think it was his personality and
I think
his
so.
charm?
He was very, I'm not going to use that horrible expression, people person, but perhaps it was the Irish in him, but he was very good at persuading people to do things.
What do you think was Shackleton's most important leadership skill, and why?
Most important leadership skills? Well, he never looked back. He's regarded optimism as the most important quality an explorer could have. But he also planned for every eventuality. And he got to know his men, which was unusual in those days. Particularly when they were living on the ice for 4 months on the tents, he personally decided who would be in each tent, not putting the officers in one tent, the men in the other, but balancing the personalities. And this was any expedition job, however menial, he could and would do, which is very unusual 100 years ago. Particularly, I think people sometimes forget what a huge gulf there was educationally between the officers and the men. Some of the men were semi-literate, even superstitious. One of the members of the expedition initially wouldn't eat penguin because he said everyone knows they contain the souls of dead sailors, So it was even more remarkable, that being so.
Is having the name Shackleton a burden or a blessing? How has being the granddaughter of such a famous explorer affected your life?
Well, of course, I can't tell how it would have been otherwise. I think it sounds a very old-fashioned thing to say. It's probably easier for a female than for a male. I never, but also for many years, the Shackleton legend was rather in abeyance. It started getting going in the 1990s. I happened to be in the Antarctic then on board HMS Endurance, the Navy's ice patrol ship that I'd named. I've named 2 ships and 4 boats, more than that would be vulgar. And the Wall Street Journal, of all papers, did an article, Prepare for Shackleton Boom, pointing out books, films, expeditions. It's just gone on and on from then. So it hasn't been a lifelong thing. But the more I learned about, I got asked to do things and more things. So I think you could say, I think it would have been bad if it had been a lifelong thing, because I didn't know. The genes got me in the end.
How important do you think Frank Hurley's photos were to our view of the expedition?
Very, very important. And Ponting was Scott's photograph, the same thing. Two of the greatest photographers of that era were the two of the greatest explorers. I mean, I've got some Hurleys, some of those wonderful black and white images. Very important.
Do you think that Shackleton should have allowed Hurley to take more photos with him when the ship cracked under the ice?
I don't, because when the ship sunk, they were allowed 2 pounds weight per man. A glass plate negative is very, very heavy. And Hurley had already dived into the ship to rescue some. My grandfather knew that he couldn't be trusted not to do that again, so he sat with him and broke up the least good photographs. It was a necessity.
So his ability to keep everybody with the same rules, even though they may have been very important.
You mean, well, yes, consistency I think is very important in a leader.
Everybody was the
unless
same.
People can see a very good reason for being inconsistent. But Hurley was a genius.
How do you think Shackleton felt when he had to give the order to abandon ship?
I think he felt heartbroken. A ship to a sailor is more than just a ship. He wrote in his diary, I cannot write about it, but very soon he'd revived and said, written, a man must set himself to a new mark directly the old one goes. His new mark was bringing every member of the expedition home alive. He gathered his men together and said calmly, ship's gone, we will go home. You have to remember, nobody knew where they were. There were no communications. They could as well have been on Mars. It was a question of leadership going, or not. They might have disappeared, no one ever heard of them again.
Do you think that Shackleton mentally struggled when the ship was beginning to break under the ice?
I don't think so. He was the leader. I don't think he mentally struggled. He was grief-stricken and worried, but not to the extent of affecting the way he led.
How do you think your grandfather felt when he had to tell the men to keep only their closest possessions and to throw everything else on the pile which they would never see again?
I don't think they thought of it quite like that. It was just something that had to be done. And he actually threw away his own gold watch and some gold sovereigns into the snow to set an example.
How did Shackleton manage to keep all of his men together and behind him, even when food supplies were diminishing?
Well, that's really the whole comes back to the whole question of leadership. Getting to know them all, their strengths and weaknesses, making each man feel valued, doing jobs with them. It's balancing the personalities, and above all, inculcating in the men the belief that not only did he expect loyalty from them, he expected loyalty from them to the expedition as a whole and to each other.
Do you believe that Shackleton should be remembered as more of a hero than Scott, and why?
I never answer that question. I will only say they were very different sort of leaders. And if you want a relevant quote, Raymond Priestley, explorer with Scott and Shackleton, wrote, for ease of travel and efficiency, give me Amundsen. For scientific research, give me Scott. When all is lost, you think all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton.
Do you believe that it was the right decision to bury Shackleton in South Georgia?
Yes, it was my grandmother's, absolutely right. My grandmother. I visited the grave several times. This is the scene of where he brought triumph from disaster.
How close was Shackleton to Frank Wilde, as they had then been in 3 separate expeditions
Very
together?
close. I mean, when he was writing about him, a member of the expedition, he said he's my other self. They're very different, absolutely, very close. He's buried in South Georgia now. They found his ashes in South Africa after they were lost for years.
What do you think is the most important thing to teach children about Shackleton and the Endurance expedition?
Well, as I said, I think leadership and planning, not just courage. I think courage itself can be a blunt instrument. Leadership, planning, having the right priorities. When he turned back, Ernest Shackleton, from the first expedition, Nimrod, from the pole, imagine turning your back on being the first man at the South Pole. They could have staggered on there, probably died. And it defined his priorities, what mattered him most. We're all defined by what matters to us most. It's quite clear what mattered him most were his men.
Finally, could you please tell me about your time working with the film Shackleton?
The Kenneth Branagh film,
Yes.
it was quite a long time ago, when I was a consultant. No, there were 2 consultants actually. It was very interesting. Kenneth Branagh was great.
Thank you for joining me on 20 Questions.
A pleasure.